My name is Faye Letster Malkin. I'm 84 years old. I'm a Holocaust survivor from Poland. I was born in 1938 in a town called Syracuse, Poland. When the Russians came into our town, under communism, you weren't allowed to own anything. Everything now belonged to the government. My parents had a confectionery store. Their parents were in the cattle business. My family was well off. Now they had nothing. Everything was taken away from them. Business came to a standstill. And that was 1939. In 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union. They broke the alliance. And the Germans were now coming into our town. I was 2 years old at the time, so I don't know what life was like before the war, but I know what my mother told me. It was, they had a good life. We spent 2 years being hidden by a Polish Catholic woman in the war. While we were in hiding, my mother's brother, my uncle, Moshe Miles, kept a diary. And after my uncle passed away, his sons translated the diary into English and had it published. My uncle describes in the diary what happened when the Germans first came into Poland. I had asked my mother, why didn't you leave? And she said, we had a good life. We were financially okay in our town. There was a culture there. And when the Germans were coming in, Germany at that time was the most advanced country in Europe. It was the most intellectual. It was the most cultured, okay, in the 1930s. So they thought now they were going to have their life back. I would like to read you a passage, a couple of paragraphs from the diary.
The Germans captured all of Syracuse, then Poland. The Ukrainian population, who had pretended to be staunch communists under the Soviets, welcomed the columns of Nazi tanks with bouquets of flowers and shouts of Heil Hitler. A Ukrainian by the name of Chernetsky was appointed mayor of Syracuse and immediately organized a Ukrainian militia to carry out the orders of the Germans. On June 30, 1941, all Jewish males between the ages of 14 and 60 were ordered to report at the open town square. When the Jews arrived at the town square, a crowd of Ukrainians was already there waiting for them, dressed in their Sunday best as if they had been invited to a party. Some big shots took over and announced that 400 Jewish males were required for labor assignments. Then they proceeded to select 400 professionals, businessmen, workers, and ordinary able-bodied individuals all at random and turn them over to a detachment of assets management. Among the 400 selectees was Eli Letzer, my sister Leah's husband. The 400 were marched off to a brick factory just outside Syracuse. There they were shot and their bodies tossed into a mass grave. That is how my sister lost her husband and my baby niece Faye, her father.
So my first memories, I was probably 3.5. The Germans set up a ghetto in our town. Now, ghettos, the Germans set up ghettos all over the areas they conquered. A ghetto was a few blocks in the center of town, surrounded by barbed wire, and all the Jews were forced to take their belongings and everything and go to the ghettos. I guess the reason for that was the Germans had a plan to exterminate all Jews, which was Hitler's goal. And they didn't have to go look for them. They were all in the ghetto. Jews did not know at that time what that plan was because it was inconceivable. So I vaguely remember moving into the ghetto with my mother. And I remember my mother sewing on yellow stars because all Jews had to be identified with yellow stars. So I remember her sewing this on. When we got into the ghetto, we were in one room of this little building. All people were living together. My grandparents were there, both sides. My mother had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Life in the ghetto there was a lot of disease. There was no medicine. There was very little food. And there was a railroad that ran into our ghetto. One of my mother's brothers worked for the railroad. And the railroad, what the Germans did was they came into ghetto because the purpose of the ghetto this was like a holding area until you were liquidated. And so the purpose was they came into the ghetto, all the Jews from the town were there. They would run, we had 3, they called them actions. We had 3 actions in our town. The first action and the second, they rounded up as many Jews as they found. They put them on these trains, cattle cars. The train went to a place called Belzitz. Now it's a death camp. It's not very well known because nobody survived Belzitz. I've been told as many as maybe 800,000 Jews were murdered there. And when you got to Belzitz, they told you they were taking you to work, and they told you to bring your belongings, suitcases. When you got there, they again told you were being taken to work, but you're going in to have a shower. They were put into the building. The gas was released, and everybody was dead. As I said, my mother had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. One of her brothers worked for the railroad, so he knew what was happening. You couldn't fight the Germans, the Nazis. The only way you could defeat them was survive. If you stayed alive, they didn't win. So they did everything in their power. So they would sneak out, and because he worked at the railroad station, he knew what was happening. They would sneak out of the ghetto at night. They'd go under the wire. And they had lived in this town in Syracuse always. Their business was there. They knew their neighbors. They had their friends there. And he'd go see the Polish people in town and ask them if they could hide his family. Everyone turned him down. And you almost can't blame him because the Germans discovered a Christian person hiding Jews, they would be murdered too and their families murdered. He found one woman, Francesca Holocaust, who he knew. She lived with her daughter, Helena. And she said, yeah, I'll hide your family. That's her picture. So when each action was over, the attitude of the Germans was, okay, we didn't get you this time, we'll get you next time. My uncles, it was very important for them to find somebody to hide their family. And the third action was the final one. And my uncle, since he had worked at the railroad, he knew this was going to be the final one. And so we snuck out at night from the ghetto and we walked to our house. Now, my mother had 2 sisters. One was very sick, and they wanted a doctor with them. So they took a very prominent doctor, Dr. David Kindler, in our town, and we walked to Francesca's house through the night. It was probably around, a mile and a half. When we got to her house, it was a little house, and there was a barn right behind the house. There was a ladder that led up to a trapdoor. The trapdoor, we moved the trapdoor. It took you up to a hayloft. There was straw on the floor. It was this type of a roof, and we all walked up there. Now, there were 13 of us there in this small space. My mother and I, her two brothers, her two sisters. One brother had a son who was like 3 years older than me, and the doctor and his wife and family. Before we went into hiding, I was the youngest one there. So they would have speeches with me, my two uncles. We're going into hiding. It's very dangerous. You have to be very quiet and you can't cry. One of my mother's brothers said, why don't you put her in front of a church or a convent? And many times the priests, the nuns would take little children and raise them. But I promised I wasn't going to cry, so they decided to take me with them. Well, when I got there, I was 4 years old, and I started crying. And I knew I shouldn't, but I remember this. So he describes it in the diary.
My little 4-year-old niece, Faye, won't stop crying. We all beg her to keep quiet, but nothing helps. Mrs. Helamayeva comes to us and says, for mercy's sake, can't you stop that child crying? Do you want the Germans to find you and kill us all? She takes a stick and begins to beat the pigs. She hopes their squeaks of pain will drown out the sound of Faye's crying. The hours go by. Faye is still crying. We were all terrified. Mrs. Helamayeva is still beating the pigs, but how much longer will she be able to keep this up? And how much longer will the poor little pigs be able to stand this? At about 8 o'clock that evening, Mrs. Helamayeva knocks on our hayloft door with her stick. We open the door. You will have to do something, she says. We promise her that we will do something. After she has left, we huddle together and discuss what we should do. We come to a terrible decision. We will have to kill Faye with poison from Dr. Kindler's medicine bag. We can't endanger 14 other lives, those of our family, the Kindlers, and 2 Helamayevas because of one child. We report our decision to Mrs. Helamayeva. She doesn't say a word. What could she say? Faye goes on crying. We cover Faye with blankets. Dr. Kindler pours a spoonful of poison from one of his vials and forces the spoon between Faye's lips. Faye makes a face, spits it out, and keeps on crying. Finally, some of the poison seems to stay in. After a few minutes, Faye stops crying. Her eyes fall shut. She appears unconscious. She does not seem to be breathing. We all squat around the little figure on the straw as if we were all sitting Shiva after a funeral. No one makes a sound. My sister Leah, Faye's mother, does not weep. I forgive you for what you have done to my child, she whispers, as long as God forgives you. One life for a chance to save 14 other lives. 2 hours later, at about 10 o'clock, Mrs. Helamayeva comes to us holding a large burlap bag. The child's soul is with God now, she says in a voice that portrays no emotion. Put her in this bag, I'll bury her. Dr. Kindler leans forward to pick up the limp little body from the straw. As he touches the child, his sensitive hands feel something unexpected. He motions to me and whispers in my ear, there's a pulse. It's faint, but I can feel it. This child's alive. It takes a moment to grasp what the doctor is saying. Then I say, if the child wasn't killed by the dose of the poison he gave her, it is nothing short of a miracle. Faye was meant to live.
We spent 21 months in hiding. We were never hungry. She fed us. She took our waste away. We were liberated in July 1944. The Russian military came into our town and we were liberated. My mother my family located an uncle and 4 aunts in Newark and in New York, and they sponsored us to come here. And we got here on January 17, 1949. When we came here to America, we lived with Holocaust survivors in Newark and an area. And I knew all these people who went through terrible things. They went on with their lives. It was very important to go on to prove to the world, to yourself, that you can go on after you went through. No matter what happens, things happen to everybody. No matter what happens, you can't let it defeat you.